Uh, Please take your seat. We would like to start. Please take your seat. We would like to start. Shh. Okay. Good afternoon. I'm honored and privileged to open and chair the closing session of this most interesting and intriguing international conference entitled From Rejection to Acceptance, to be Jewish in 21st Century Germany. And this title reminds me of the famous saying of the Jewish German poet Heinrich Heine, to be a Jew is not a shame, it's a disaster. Today in the United Germany, to be Jewish is neither a shame nor a disaster, but it is an ongoing conscious struggle to define its identity and its cultural roots, to cope with the remembrance of the terrible past, the Holocaust, and the desire to integrate into the accepting and open, European-oriented new German society, to address emerging signs of anti-Semitism, which in many cases appears also as anti-Zionism. And the Jewish community in Germany is the largest in Europe and growing, and it comprises of Jews who stayed in Germany after the war and developed separately in West and East Germany until the unification of Jews from the former Soviet Union that came after the fall of the wall and the Soviet Empire, and even of many Israelis who discovered, in particular in Berlin, an attractive European cultural center, and in Germany at large, a European financial and business centers. Some of these issues, many of these issues and aspects which you discussed in the conference, and they will be addressed again also in this closing session. Jews in Germany, looking backward, looking forward. We have three very distinguished panelists with us: Professor Fania Oz-Salzberger, Dr. Ronnie Stauber, and Ambassador retired Reuven Merchav. I will present each of them in due time. Each lecture will take about 30 minutes, followed by urgent short questions and remarks, and then after the panelists finish, we'll open it to more questions and remarks. And then we will hear some closing remarks by Professor Dina Porat. Okay, so our first speaker is Professor Fania Oz-Salzberger. She is an Israeli historian and writer, professor of history at the University of Haifa, School of Law, and Center for German and European Studies. Her doctoral thesis on the Scottish and German Enlightenments was written at the University of Oxford, supervised by Dr. John Robertson, and mentored by the very famous philosopher Isaiah Berlin. She's teaching at the University of Haifa since 1993, and she was appointed associate professor in 2009. Her book, Israelis in Berlin, became a prism of Israeli-German dialogue. She is active on advisory board of the Israel Democracy Institute and the German-Israel Future Forum. At the University of Haifa, she served as a joint editor-in-chief of the Haifa University Press. She is director of the Posen Research Forum for Jewish European and Israelis Political Thought. She was a fellow of the Institute for Advanced Studies in Berlin, And between 2007 and 2012, she held the Leon Lieberman Chair in Modern Israel Studies at Monash University in Australian Center for Jewish Civilization. In 2009-10, she was the Lawrence Rockefeller Visiting Professor for Distinguished Teaching at the University Center for Human Values at Princeton University. She has published many essays in the history of ideas and political thought, most recently on translation in the European Enlightenment, on the biblical sources of John Locke, and on inter-civilization conflict. So, Professor Fania Oz, please.
Toda rabba. Can we try to speak from here?
You are allowed.
The audience will judge. Kann man mich hören? Can you hear me well? So I will stay put. I think it is more convenient. Thank you very much for the elaborate introduction. I have just looked at the program and realized that I have been given a title. I think it is Jews and Germany, a personal perspective. I do not know about personal, but I will offer a somewhat adjusted perspective on, obviously, Israelis and Germany. This is what I have been looking into for the last 13 or 14 years. Obviously, not all Israelis are Jews. And indeed, when I wrote my essay or travel book titled Israelis in Berlin 13 years ago, I met with quite a few Israelis residing in Berlin at the time, Jews and non-Jews alike. I will turn back to that in a minute. It was a story of both enchantment and amazement. The enchantment of Israelis, mainly younger Israelis, who found their way into what was, again, the capital city of the United Federal Republic of Germany in the 1990s and in the 2000s. Their enchantment, fascination, perhaps even obsession, and amazement, on the other hand, at the very fact that by a historical length or measure, so soon after the end of the Holocaust, not only Jews, notably from the former Soviet Union, but also so many Israelis, many of them born in Israel, many of them coming from families who had some Holocaust memories and wounds and pain, had chosen to establish their abode temporarily or not temporarily in Berlin. So I interviewed about 20 very different Israelis who lived in the German capital at the time, from the Concertmeister of the Berliner Philharmonie all the way to young Bohemian artists, clubbers, people in the music scene, academics, women and men who married Germans and started a family in Germany, and many, many others. Among them were several Arab Israelis. Indeed, one of the most interesting new perspectives I found in those conversations was with an Arab Israeli resident of Berlin, whom I interviewed. The interview took place in a nightclub. And this guy, when I asked him, as I asked everybody else, what landscape do you miss from home, from Israel, from your childhood or maybe previous years' landscape when you still lived in Israel? His longing was for the urban landscape of Tel Aviv rather than his native city of Akko or Acre. And that was quite interesting. That was when I realized, it was a moment of discovery for me, that what I liked most about the Berlin prism on Israel, back on Israel, the unique set of lenses that Berlin can provide for us Israelis, for our own self-image and understanding of our identity, is that it is a mind-boggling prism, breaking old habits, breaking preconceptions, offering surprises. An Israeli Arab who longs for Tel Aviv, who misses Tel Aviv, is a surprise from the local perspective, not so much when you talk to him in a Berlin nightclub. Berlin can tell us something new about Tel Aviv, I have suggested. And I increasingly think, by the way, that Tel Aviv can also tell us a couple of new things about Berlin today and in the past. It was enormously refreshing to view Israel and Israelis from the Berlin vantage point. Today, I'm preparing a new edition of the book. It will be the same book, but with a new introduction, trying to bring it up to date. Of course, since the time I wrote Israelis in Berlin back in 1999, 2000, the floodgates broke loose. People tell me that I had identified a trend in the making. If in the year 1999 I went to inquire how many Israelis actually live in Berlin, and the embassy couldn't tell me, and some other people cautiously said maybe a few thousand, maybe a couple of thousand. Now we are talking about many, many thousands, a very, very vibrant scene. Today you can hear Hebrew spoken on the streets of Berlin, in its museums and concert halls quite often. When I wrote my book, it was very unusual to hear the Hebrew language spoken in loud conversation on the street in Berlin. Indeed, in the book I recall a conversation taking place in Hebrew in Charlottenburg on the streets, but it takes place in the year 1915. And that's from a novella by Shmuel Yosef Agnon called Ad Hena, when Agnon and a bunch of young Eretz Israelis, as they were considered at the time, including one sculptor who was called Druzi, or a Druze, obviously of the Druze minority in what was then Eretz Israel, are taking a night walk, young people loudly speaking, and they could only speak Hebrew, of course, among them, although most of them were born in Russia or Germany, and there was this Druze artist and a couple who were already born in Eretz Israel. And then, back in 1915, in Agnon's novella at least, the streets of Berlin heard Israeli conversation, Hebrew conversation. And in my book I wrote no more, no longer, and of course today you can hear Hebrew spoken loudly, apart from certain parts of Berlin where people are still a bit apprehensive about speaking Hebrew, because there have been noted attacks against Hebrew-speaking and indeed kippah-wearing Jews in Berlin as well. But you can definitely hear Hebrew in the main parts of the city. So there are many thousands of Israelis in Berlin today, and these many thousands are not a community. They are many thousands of individuals. Because what really characterizes Israelis in Berlin then and now is that they are not forming what has been called in the scientific literature an expat community, expatriate community. You have such expat communities of Israelis in Los Angeles and in Melbourne and in New York and in other places, Calgary, other places around the globe. In Berlin, they are not a community. There are very great many individuals, and quite a few of those individuals are extremely individualistic. They are young, they are alternative, they are rebellious, they are artists, they are bohemians, they are hype, or hipsters, as they call them today. I don't think anybody can self-define themselves as bohemian today, but hipster, yes. And what they do form is a whole federation of micro communities. So Israeli artists get together, musicians. The gay community, of course, has many elements of a community within it. There is an Israeli radio station, Kol Berlin, Hebrew and German radio station. There are some networking meetings going on, networking of young professionals, Israeli professionals living and working in Berlin. Last I heard was that these networking meetings take place every couple of months in the bar Luigi Zuckerman in Mitte, which had become quite a place for Israelis to hang around. So it is not an expat community of the older type, with families meeting for the holidays or the synagogue being a meeting place, as happens quite often in Israeli communities in the United States, not in Berlin. The synagogue is not part of it. The Jewish community is by and large not part of it. And there is no single Israeli community, but a network of micro communities. There is vibrant life on the internet. I will get back to it in a while. And there is a sense of new normality. So the amazement had gone. My question, how can you be an Israeli and live in Berlin and hear those voices screaming from under the pavement stones, from the cellars, the secrets, the ambushes of history, as I called them 13 years ago. My sense today is that most Israelis do not ask themselves those questions anymore. They are no longer amazed at themselves living in the capital of Germany, which was the capital of the Third Reich, but they are still enchanted, fascinated, even obsessed. And indeed, the obsession is mutual. Many Germans are obsessed with things Jewish, things Israeli, with the state of Israel, and many Jews and Israelis are obsessed today with all things or many things German. Look at Israeli literature. When I wrote Israelis in Berlin, beginning in 1999, I had to dig hard for Israeli literature written about Germany or even in Germany. And we had a handful, not more than that. We had a few spy novels by Mishka Ben David. We had the famous reportage anthology by Amos Eilon, Be'eretz Redufat Ha'avar, in a past persecuted country, which he wrote when he was the correspondent for Haaretz newspaper in Bonn, by the way, not in Berlin. Dan Ben Amotz wrote his book Lizkor and Lishkoach, to remember and to forget. Again, not about Berlin, but some of the story takes place in Frankfurt am Main. Aleph Bet Yehoshua devoted one chapter of his novel Molcho back in the 1980s when his protagonist Molcho travels to Berlin. But all Molcho does in Berlin, and that's quite typical, all he does in Berlin is sit in a hotel room and reflect on his past marriage and on his dead wife. So it's not so much about Berlin, it is about Molcho, which is quite typical of much Israeli literature. Even when they go outside, it's themselves and their country and society they are really talking to. And then something new happened. In the last decade, ever since, not because, but ever since Israelis in Berlin came out, major Israeli books, novels, memoirs are written not only about Germany, not only does the plot take place in Germany and quite often in Berlin, but they are actually written in residence, in Germany, in the Villa Wannsee. Of course, I'm talking about the guest house for writers, and elsewhere in academic hospitality situations. Yoram Kaniuk's book on Germany, Chaim Be'er's book, Lifnei HaMakom, with a title, word Makom, literally translated as place, can mean both the deity, God Almighty himself, but also the place, and Berlin is the place, just the way that the Jews of Amsterdam in the old days called Amsterdam in their specific language, Mokum, also derives from the Hebrew Makom, place, our place. Berlin is once again our place. Our books are now being written, not just about it, but in it. And Rubik Rosenthal's memoir of his lost family in East Berlin, and there are several examples, other examples too. The cinema, of course, several major Israeli films were shot partially on location in Berlin, and of course are being showed and screened in Berlin in the festival and off the festival very, very often. And this is something new. So in a broad sense, I often tell that to my German audiences, we are coming back. And this comeback shall be revisited in a little while. But for the time being, it's important for me to spell out that Berlin, for us, is no longer taboo. It had been de-tabooed. By the way, Berlin more than Germany. Because the city always walks ahead of the country in such cultural processes. Tel Aviv walks ahead of Israel and Berlin walks ahead of Germany in their extremely rich mutual dialogue today. It is a dialogue between cities and people from these cities more than a dialogue between countries, and it has very little to do with the official Israel, Jerusalem if you like, and the official Germany, what used to be Bonn and is now the Kanzleramt in Berlin. This is the unofficial dialogue, and it takes place not between countries, but indeed between cities. By the way, since I mentioned Israeli literature being written on location in Berlin, I can also tell you I've very recently found on the internet, where many of these very interesting new developments take place, a new journal which is being edited, launched and edited by young Israelis, Israeli scholars in Berlin. It is called Mikan Ve'elach, which is also an interesting allusion. Can be translated as from here henceforward. But it is a journal in Hebrew which defines itself as Hebrew diasporic, and it is trying to pick up the threads of the Haskalah, the Hebrew-speaking German Haskalah, and the writings of Weisel and Mendelssohn and the 19th century Haskalah, both publishing it anew, afresh in the journal, and writing new Hebrew literature which is not Israeli-based. What I find very interesting about this very young experimental journal is that this is what might have happened had the young European Hebrew-speaking culture been allowed to live. If it had not been murdered, we would have had pockets, as there were indeed pockets ever since the late 18th century until the early 20th century, of Hebrew-speaking, Hebrew writing, Hebrew publishing culture in Warsaw, in Odessa, elsewhere, obviously in Berlin. So somebody in Berlin is sitting today and trying to pick up the threads. I am assuming it is a non-Zionist or maybe anti-Zionist experiment, a non-Israeli Hebrew hub of culture, and I salute it nonetheless. I think it's very interesting. אפשר להגיד. Berlin too has changed over the years. Berlin is not what it was when I first came there in the late 80s, immediately following when the whole wall was half fallen. I was there. It was still standing in parts. Berlin is definitely not what I saw in 1999 and 2000. And ever since that time, every time I visit, I find a somewhat new city as well. And it is our prism as Israelis that can help Berlin find out what is happening to it as it moves along into becoming the full-fledged capital of the Federal Republic of Germany, and some people say capital, the real capital of Europe, although that is, of course, debatable. So one Israeli prism I can offer you, there are many, but I will limit myself to one, is that the alternative Berlin, the poor, sexy, as it likes to call itself, raggedy Berlin of the old Kreuzberg, of Prenzlauer Berg before it was gentrified, of the Club Tachles that has just been shut down, and it's no longer there, this amazing hippie complex of alternative art, which so attracted young Israelis in the last 2 decades. It's going down the hill now. The Kanzler's Berlin is slowly but surely conquering, pushing out the alternative, sexy, raggedy Berlin of the old days, with its quasi-socialist pretenses and quasi-revolutionary pretenses, and so on. And for us Israelis, or for people slightly younger than myself that were deeply attracted to that Berlin, who came to squat in that Berlin, it is a loss, because Berlin is increasingly more official, richer, more formalized, more bourgeois, more middle class than it was before. And this is something that Israelis can tell Berlin about its own transformation over the last 2 decades. I can share quite a few other thoughts, but I think time is slowly running out. I have another about 10 minutes, so I can go on for a bit. I want to say something about Germany versus Sepharad, or Spain of the old days. Because one of the most interesting questions that keeps popping up when I lecture about Israelis in Berlin, here in Israel, never in Germany, but here in Israel, there's always somebody in the audience who is usually extremely judgmental about Israelis who are going to live on the side of the enemy. And they asked me, how come we never went back to Sepharad, to Spain, in over 500 years now? And we are going back to Germany so quickly. How can that be? And I think it is a provocative question, maybe not even a very good question, but it has some very good answers, very interesting answers. The differences between that Sepharad of Ferdinand and Isabella, who brought such calamity on a whole generation of Jews, and the Germany of Adolf Hitler, who brought such calamities, far greater calamities on a whole generation of Jews. The differences are numerous and have to do with modernity, but not only with modernity. And the first and greatest difference is simply the Germans. Spain never asked us back. Spain apologized about 2 years ago, more or less officially. Somebody said something. I don't remember if it was the king or the prime minister. Spain, even when it was deteriorating sensationally in the 17th and 18th century, losing everything it had gained from its colonies, translating everything into bullion and then squandering the bullion or the money and left with nothing when other superpowers were rising, never called the Jews back, never asked itself, what have we done? We have lost the Jews, we have lost our economic staying power or our cultural staying power. That never happened in Spain, in Sepharad. It happened in Germany within less than a generation after the World War, after the Shoah. So the Germans are the biggest difference between today's Germany and the 500 years of Sepharad. But of course, the very existence of the state of Israel is a tremendous difference. It allows Israelis for the first time to travel the world not so much as wandering Jews, although we all still have something of the wandering Jew in us, but as people who have a home base, who have a passport. Even when people are queuing for other passports, let's keep in mind that this one blue passport is a rock, and so far a solid one. This makes Israelis different nomads, different vagabonds than any Jew before them. And of course, modernity, the politics of memory are different, the media of memory is different, literature, cinema, culture, engagement, people to people, all these forces never worked for Sfarad and its lost Jews. They are working full steam for Germany and the descendants of its lost Jews. Another thing has transformed tremendously since the Middle Ages or the early modern period, and that is migration itself. It has transformed over the last 20 years. 20 years ago, Israelis used to talk about Yordim, the downgoers, those leaving Israel as those who are stepping down from the high, from the elevation of being here in the Holy Land. Then a more neutral term emerged, both in scientific literature and in the public sphere. Mehagrim, migrants. It became a more neutral term. Now I have doctoral students who are talking about transnationals. Israelis living abroad are no longer Yordim, downgoers or migrants. They are transnationals. They belong to more than one nation, or they belong to the world itself, or they travel constantly between countries. Some people have a home in Tel Aviv and a home in Berlin, a home in New York and a home in Haifa. It is doable these days, and I've seen such people. And of course, you have many friends. I got an offer of friendship from the new Facebook page of Ravensbrück concentration camp museum. I was very touched because I have a family connection to the Ravensbrück concentration camp. And suddenly up comes Ravensbrück on my computer offering me friendship, which I accepted, the museum obviously, which I accepted. This is part of an unimaginable future, but I think possibly a positive future of the German Jewish dish. Thank you very much.